We run into problems where the C of O says it's a 2-family and it's being utilized as a 3-family or a 4-family. That's a problem. Banks will follow 2 things. They will follow the C of O, and if we're lucky enough, the building was built prior to CO laws in 1938, and that takes away one part of the problem. But then a bank will look towards the taxation. How is that property, that townhouse, being taxed? So if it's being taxed as a 2-family, if the house was built prior to CO laws, that's the defaulting number that a bank will look for. So we're finding that the improper usage in the wrong direction, meaning more units than are supposed to be there, can be a problem. How do we get around that? It's actually pretty easy. There are enough lenders that will allow you to remove a stove in the additional unit, cap the gas line, take the refrigerator out, and then we're good to go. But that's probably the biggest issue. That, along with potential violations that you may find on a townhouse that the seller may not be aware of and the buyer certainly was not aware of. Depending on the nature of the violation, you can oftentimes get a bank to consider escrowing, sometimes not. It depends on whether or not the violation is considered to be a hazard to people or not. If it's not hazardous, then we can work around it. So those are probably the 2 biggest pitfalls.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Deanna and Heather, if I can ask you, if you're bringing a townhouse to market, what do you look into to learn more about that townhouse to kind of figure out what potential pitfalls there could be before you bring a property to market?
Well, I mean, we do look at the C of O, because you want to see if the C of O is up to date and if it fits what you have in the house. And again, I mean, right now I'm about to bring a 2-family that's being used as a 1-family to market, so we've looked at that just to make sure that that's actually in line. We also have had some issues with houses that have been vacated that never destabilized their rental units when it was a multifamily, or they didn't change the C of O and so forth. And that has been actually something that's made it really difficult, even when they've done, and there's something that came up in one situation in particular where it was changed in the Department of Finance, but it wasn't changed in DOB. And that took 9 months. So thankfully the buyer hung on, but it is something that we made an assumption. It's one of those mistakes you'll never make again, right? Because once you've had that, forget it. But you do, looking at, if it has been a multifamily in the past and been rented out, very important to look, and that's a whole different area in the department, and to look back at the rental records and all of that. It's a process. So it really depends on how the house was used, and over the years, if you look back, sometimes you can see it. If sometimes you can't, depending on where you're looking. But it is always a good idea, and I do ask often either attorneys or I will ask you, Brian, to look back, because having and knowing this information, I always look at violations. I do a lot of due diligence on the building, and I bring it up to the owner in advance, because when you don't, then it comes back to bite you. I mean, those are just the initial things that I would say.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the same thing. I mean, the C of O is the very first thing you go to. And, also if you're dealing with a house that was recently renovated, that's really important to start digging around and looking, because maybe it has a temporary certificate of occupancy, still has some hurdles to get through, and you need to try to understand what those hurdles are going to be. So also being able to go to the Department of Buildings website and looking up past job filings, items required for the COO, and just really, you have to dig around to find these things. So taking the time to do that, to find them, I think is crucial. And again, finding other violations, HPD violations, which is literally if a townhouse owner doesn't file every year with HPD, they're in violation. So, that, and then finding out about the easements. And, I just had a deal recently where I didn't have a communicative attorney on the buy side. And when he did the deal, didn't convey that there was a special licensing agreement to the rear garden so that the building behind could do facade, local law work. And my buyer turned into a seller in a very short period of time. So on the sell side, we had to deal with those issues. And it caught me off guard. So, really making sure that you do get the proper communications from your seller when they bought, if that's possible, right? Some people might have owned for 30 years, so they don't know. But I think having those communications with your seller so that they understand how important these things are, because if not, you're going to have a real mess on the transaction side.
Yeah, I think I think you hit it right on the head. When you're talking about due diligence on townhouses, the city has tremendous resources online for everybody to access. And whenever you're looking at these townhouse properties, I always recommend, first thing, go to Acris, pull up the deed, pull up the mortgage. And I'm going to go through the reasons for each one. Go to the DOB website, pull up the description of property and the CO. Go to the Department of Finance, pull up the tax bill, see what the taxes are in comparison to taxes in the neighborhood. And when you go through each one of these, why do we go in Acris? The deed, how many people read a deed on a townhouse transaction? Very few, right? Not many. Quite honestly, it's not, generally speaking, it's a boilerplate document that just has the generic information of the building. I had one in Harlem years ago. Our client was buying a townhouse that there was a part of Harlem that was owned, I guess, the city took it over. It was dilapidated, and the city sold these townhouses to investors or owners who would bring them up and fix them up and renovate them for $1, right? But part of that deal was that the owner of the building had to occupy the building. So it was like I had one where it's 4-family. The owner had to occupy one of the units in order for 25 years. That was a deed restriction in the deed. My client was going in purely for investment. So if we didn't look at the deed to catch this, they would have bought a property that basically would have been, it would have negated the entire premise of the acquisition for them, right? And that's something that you would never see in a Cobra condo, ever. What else about townhouses? The prices are high. They're big ticket items. If there's a mortgage on a property, I joke all the time, and I avoid the topic of politics like the plague, but there's one tax nobody in America likes paying, and that's mortgage recording tax. No matter what your views are, I've never met a person that said, I love paying a tax to the state for the privilege of taking debt out of New York State, right? If I'm wrong, correct me, but I'm spot on for thousand on this joke. So mortgage recording tax. You have a client that's buying a place for $10 million. They have a $5 million mortgage. If the seller has a $5 million mortgage, outstanding on it. If you can facilitate an assignment of mortgage and save them roughly $100,000 on this tax, you create a friend for life, right? You create a client that's going to love you for the rest of eternity. That is how you bring value. I can't tell you what I do. It is pretty funny. I try not to get clients too excited about this because my favorite thing is to say, hey, I just saved you $75,000. And they're like, how? How did you pull this off? I had one recently, last year I did it. The guy didn't get it, and he referred me to a friend of his. He goes, Pierre has like this magic machine that saves you like $75,000 in mortgage recording tax. Ask him about this machine. It's like a program he has online. It's no program. It's honestly just knowing how to do this technically by Department of Finance rules. And it's honestly not as complicated as it first appears. But that's why we're looking at the mortgage.